There could hardly be a better partnership for this session on the Queensland House than these two organisations, given that they bring together both material culture, history, heritage, archival research, visual storytelling, and the many traces and forces that shape the walls that surround us on a domestic level. And the story of the Queensland House is also a story of the land, so I must also acknowledge its traditional owners, past and present, and specifically the Turrbal people and Yagara people. My name's Kate Evans, and I'm both a historian and a broadcaster with ABC-RN. And today we have an extraordinary range of expertise in the room with us, with a panel of historians, archivists and researchers. And you'll also have an opportunity to ask them questions at the end of their presentations. And if you miss anything, I should say that this session is being recorded and will be available on the SLQ website. So that means please turn your mobile phones to silent if you haven't done so already, but do feel free to tweet. And you can use the hashtag SLQJOL and say lots of wonderful and detailed things about what you hear. And your own research opportunities and interests can be extended straight after the session, because up on level 4 in the John Oxley Library Reading Room, there's a really fantastic range of resources available for you to look at, and we'll talk more about that later. But first to the house, whether they be made of mud, sticks or bricks, because we think we know what a house is: walls, a door, windows, and then if we think Queensland, we might add stilts, a veranda and imagine it in wood. But not all houses historically have had much in the way of windows. Not all houses in Queensland are on stilts. Some were made of wattle and daub, and it's been lovely to see these examples behind us from the JOL collection too, I might say. Indeed, some houses were made of canvas. In some houses, you might think about what happened at the front door. At others, all the action was in a lean-to or a kitchen built separate to the house. I've read diaries here in the John Oxley from the 1880s that reminded me that a house on a rural homestead in Queensland also stood in relation to the Aboriginal camp or the shearers' quarters down the back. And of course, we've all seen, or I hope you've seen, the pictures upstairs right now in the Floodlines exhibition showing houses in Brisbane in 1893 flooded to the rooftop. So a house might be a place for cane cutters or seamstresses. It might be a boarding house or rented public housing. It might have been in a family for generations or be full of squatters or itinerants. And let's not forget the big house, the slang term for the jail, but we're not really talking about that today. So the house might be revealed through Department of Housing plans or rent books, through house removals or even grand and beautiful plans for a house that was never built. It might be a story of eviction or one of comfort and retreat. And the house can so much be a background to the dramas, stories, plans, gardens and artefacts of our house that we don't even see its richness, don't recognise it as a storehouse for our culture. And that's why we're so very lucky to have 3 experts today to help illuminate that story. We're going to begin with architectural historian Don Watson, taking us to a particular place, Maryborough, as a way to show how much can be read into domestic architecture. And then Annabel Lloyd will both tell stories and reveal secrets of the archive, while historian Mary Howells shows just how you can trace some of those hidden stories and why official records are full of sweat and the mortar that holds history together. But first, let's hear from Don Watson, and 3 of us are going to run back and forward to make sure that we can see the story and listen. So welcome to Don Watson.
I always hate this where I'm going to need some help to get going. I'm sorry. How do I get out of it? Mine's on my... Thanks. Well, I'm going to cover a very limited part of the story of the Queensland House, and you might say, why Maryborough? And it relates to being asked last year to give a talk at the Garden History Conference, which was being held in Maryborough. And my first inclination when I was asked was to talk about the natural environment that existed here and on which the whole timber tradition in Queensland depended. And this is a pretty pathetic slide, but it's extraordinary that so completely has this landscape been obliterated that it's hard to even find pictures of it. There are pictures of cleared paddocks, there are pictures of cutting the forest down, but very little evidence of what the original landscape was like. So this is a sort of fairly pathetic green cross and a picture actually of scrub at the Tweed. But I quickly realised, or fairly quickly realised, that that wasn't what I was expected to talk about at all. I was expected to talk about the houses in Maryborough, which I agree are a fantastic collection of what might be one of Australia's most distinctive architectural traditions. I attempted to reconcile this sort of conflict between my inclination and what I was expected to do by trying to relate it to the landscape and the materials used for the dwellings. Obviously timber, but also clay. But rationally, with floods of preoccupation, I went further, suggesting that the riverine environment might have provided the simplest of materials, reeds and straw, for building, as had happened in southern colonies. There's not much work being done on it up here. This suggested the title Straw, Sticks and Bricks, and they're the materials of choice of three well-known pigs in a story first published in England in 1842, the year that Andrew Petrie discovered the Mary River. A problem with the fable is that the sequence both is and is not followed with houses in Maryborough. It may or may not have started with straw. Bark was readily available and was much more suitable for local conditions. And bricks were not unusual at separation quite early in the history of the town. And of course, as you know, that bricks did triumph in the end anyway, and masonry became dominant after the Second World War. The problem with talking about houses in Maryborough is it's 30 years since I'd been to the city, so I depended on sources which Annabel and Mary will talk about later, in particular land titles and surveys at the Department of Environment and Resource Management, and post office directories and photographs at the library here. Wide-ranging surveys of this type used to be called windscreen surveys, but this is a survey of a different type, a screen survey of a different type, based on web maps and photographs. So I have a strange relationship with the town, which is mostly kind of roofscapes and individual sites. A strange understanding of the topography and things. But if I'd had time, the time spent in Maryborough using rate books and building registers would significantly improve the result, as will the eventual digitisation of the local newspapers, the Maryborough Chronicle and Gympie Times. I don't know how many of you are researchers, but the digitisation of newspapers has just transformed research. And that'll happen for the area in Maryborough in due course, I hope. The brief and discursive chronology which follows finishes of World War II included is quite a deal of speculation. I like speculation. It's a trigger to getting a response and to thinking further about it. So some of it's not proven always, but it's generally supported by the evidence. I might say some of the Maryborough historians don't agree with my conclusions, and I'll mention that perhaps. Not knowing who the audience is going to be today, I'll start with a very simplified formal evolution of the roof of Queenslanders. That's the pigs. And partly I wanted to just run through this. This is a bungalow roof where the main roof was continuous with the veranda. This roof here is a box roof, which became popular in the 1880s. Different profile veranda roofs. This is an OG roof here, which is important in Maryborough. The box was expanded with rooms to the front, that gable roof, but at the turn of the century, bungalow roofs became popular again. But in Maryborough, it reverted to this box roof form. In the 30s, you know, there's multiple gable on the front. I want to mention kitchens briefly. There's a detached kitchen, a kitchen wing, and finish with this, which I'd never noticed before, although I had looked at Maryborough houses before, and this I'm calling a semi-detached kitchen. It comes off the rear back corner of the house. It connects to the main house only by a post. I think it's very clever innovation. It also kind of shows a change in kitchens, which generally earlier than this would have a servant's room attached, and this is just a single room. By the early 20th century, the woman in the house, or the man perhaps, was doing the cooking. There weren't so many servants anymore. But these are very common around Maryborough. I'd never noticed them before. I wanted to briefly mention some regional variations, and they're important in any of these general studies, and they evolve over time. But because we've got a very young European history, almost all of them, I think, can be related to a particular individual, an architect or a builder or a building firm. I want to mention high blocks. They're much earlier. I've turned up earlier houses in Maryborough than I believed existed. These continuous window shades are a distinctive element on a number of houses. These OG roofs that I mentioned are significant both in Maryborough and Gympie. I'll mention those. This box, gabled hip box roof form is very common. It's here too. And there are a whole group of houses of this kind with a projecting pediment entry that I think are probably the work of one person, but I don't know who it is. But we'll come to that later. I was also interested in these veranda curtains here, these arched veranda curtains infilled with vertical battens. They're very distinctive in Maryborough. They're done in other places. There are ones in Brisbane, but there are large numbers, and again, I think they're the work of a particular architect, but maybe more than one. For the Garden History Conference, it was located, being given at the Brolga Theatre here, so there were walks associated with the conference. So I concentrated houses initially that were in the vicinity of the theatre. And I'll use this diagram through the talk, but cropped, to show about houses I'm talking about. These are other houses I've done subsequently, and I'll mention only a very few of them. The key piece of this is the bridge at Ferry Road, the main southern entrance into Maryborough, and the river, the shape of the river's a clue. That's the site of the original settlement. It was moved downstream. So what was the Mary River like when settlement was first made? When Andrew Petrie first visited, like rivers throughout southeast Queensland, the Mary River settlement was a complex pattern of wetlands, including swamps, which were given names like those in the pocket. This point in the river is called the pocket. That's a current Google Earth shot of it. Like the ones in the pocket, which are called reedy and long lagoons. This is Reedy Lagoon and that's Long Lagoon. The latter, this one, you can see survives in its own sort of way, not with any water in it, but now with a railway line instead of its reedy verge. Considerable sums were spent in draining these wetlands, and this is a slide of New Farm, and all of these black lines are drains in New Farm to turn the peninsula there from what was largely a sort of wetland into suburbia. There was very little comment about sort of negative consequences of this filling, but this is an example up on the Mary River where the destabilised banks collapsed, completely clogging the formerly navigable river in part to sandbanks and debris. In southern materials, material collected from lagoons and other grass-like materials were used for thatching, and there are instances in Queensland. This must be one of the very first. It's the corn crib at the original penal settlement, one of the very first buildings built there, but that roof there is according to John Steele, blady grass. It was also used at settlements like Townsvale, Robert Towns' cotton plantation down on the Logan River. This is the Logan River here, and that's the town settlement. This is Verisdale for anyone who comes from the southern outskirts of Brisbane. And the roofs at this settlement were described as all being of grass, almost all of grass. And Townsvale was the first plantation to use indentured labour from the South Sea Islands, and quite possibly the labourers constructed the roofs of their accommodation, as happened later on northern sugar plantations. Their later importation, I might say, funded some of Maryborough's mansions. Turning to sticks, Queenslanders are built of timber rather than brick, not because there was no suitable clay, but due to the original presence of those forests I described. They were endowed with an abundance of both hard and softwoods, usefully juxtaposed in adjacent forest types, in what on the one hand were termed scrubs, and as we don't use the term in the same way, they were rainforests, including hoop, bunya, kauri pine and joinery timbers, and on the other open eucalypt forests with excellent hardwood. And as I mentioned, so little interest was taken in their character that there's little evidence now, and it's very hard to envisage what it was like. There are some sketches by people like Conrad Martins, and there are almost no photographs. There was more interest in the felling rather than in the forests themselves. Previously, for a forest history conference, I suggested a way to approximately establish the distribution of these forests. The juxtaposition has a distinctive piebald pattern which evolved and was maintained by Aborigines through fire stick farming, the regular low-temperature burning of the open eucalypt scrubs, the open eucalypt forests, rather. The scrubs were fire-resistant, so they contained the fire. So it was effectively just continual burning of these paddocks contained by this dense rainforest. The regular burning resulted in green pick, that regrowth on the eucalypt forest floor, which was the attracted prey, and the open forest contained by the scrubs were a very good place to hunt. It was also a manicured landscape immediately useful for pastoralists and their shepherds. The research I did was based initially on the surveys of pastoral runs undertaken after the Crown Lands Alienation Act of 1868, 20 years after these holdings had been taken up, but before extensive clearing which followed their subdivision and the replacement of shepherds by fencing. This is a feature survey of the Mary River Valley, which was fortuitously done just before gold was discovered. This is 6 Mile Creek, and it's one of a whole group of surveys that do show this extraordinary pattern of the landscape. But within half a century of settlement, what had been a veritable Garden of Eden, that's a quote, was being largely cleared. So well supplied was the Wide Bay region with timber that there was little incentive locally to rationalise sawn timber construction, as happened in Brisbane and Rockhampton in 1865 with the coincidental development of outside studding. That's the practice of exposing the frame externally with just a single skin lining. It was relatively less important at Maryborough, and this is an example of 1895, somewhat later, by which time the timber was being brought from further afield, so there was some incentive to use less. But up until that time, they were more likely to sheet it both internally and externally, or where the frame was expressed, they generally used less evocative patterns of bracing. Historically, timber for dwellings, timber is a material of choice, and masonry predominates only after native forests are felled. But before steam sawmilling, a sawn timber building could cost as much as brick. Sometimes it was easier to dig and fire clay on a building site than pit saw weatherboards. This is the original a survey of the original settlement, a survey of 1850, and it does show a lot of saw pits along the river edge. There are 5 of them there. E.T. Aldridge bought skilled tradesmen from the south to rebuild his inn when the settlement was relocated to the present site, and brickmakers and layers remained to build brick houses. They were probably responsible for Rose Hill, built about 1859 at Tanana as a townhouse for John Eaton, owner of the station T-Bar. It survives unrecognisable but without its upper floor. Although Rosehill was not a plantation, Eaton was a sugar pioneer, using canes he brought from Port Macquarie. After demonstrating that sugar cane would grow successfully here, Eaton supplied canes to John Buell for Louis Hope at Ormiston. Eaton, or whoever designed Rosehill, was obviously familiar with plantation houses in the West Indies and elsewhere, and typical of the arcaded lower story. That's this brick base with these arcades, and the frame superstructure above. The photo is supposed to have been taken when the Queensland Governor visited the estate in 1860. The arcaded lower floor of Rosehill anticipated the batten curtains to the ground floor of high-set Queenslanders of half a century later. But this is a really extraordinary house for the date. I mean, it's unbelievable. I find it nearly unbelievable. In the early 1860s, there was a surplus of bricks, and at least one other house survives from this period, apparently intact and listed. It was built for the Mayor of Maryborough, William Dowser, a saddler and storekeeper who caused tenders in 1864 for brick and stonework of a 12-roomed house. That's a big house. When the house was sold to Edward Corser in 1868, it was said to be unfinished. Not long afterwards, its cast iron balustrading and corrugated iron roofing would have been more readily available. It is thought that Dowser may have drawn the plans, but there was no shortage of architects after separation in Queensland. Lots of people came. Separation was an opportunity for work, and architects just go where the work's available. So there are the tourist spots and things now. And houses like this were quite common in Brisbane, the bungalow roofs of that type. Benjamin Backhouse, who designed the Maryborougho's National School of Brick, built in 1865, was doing houses of this type in Brisbane. After gold was discovered at Gympie in 1867, Backhouse opened a branch office at Maryborough, perhaps in time to oversee the completion of Eskdale. I don't know that he had any involvement, but it's possible. But until the mid-1860s, even 1870, Maryborough buildings were more likely to be rudimentary but less interesting than this butcher shop, than they like Rosehill and Eskdale. I must say it's a terrific building. It's not an uncommon pattern, that complete covering of ladders for a butcher shop. But until steam sawmill, frame buildings were generally mostly unlined and unsealed, like this one. Until steam sawmilling became commonplace, sawn timber was expensive. Demand often outstripped supply. And Backhouse's brick school was built just before the Board of General Education changed their schools to timber, using outside studying. After 1867, architects came to the Mary River from the Otago in New Zealand and waning Australian goldfields, but more is known of their work at Gympie than in Maryborough, which boomed as a port and industrial base for both the goldfields and the sugar industry. To improve marine access, an imported cast iron lighthouse was built at Sandy Cape by the Rooney brothers, who I might say deserve more press in this talk than I'm going to give them, and supervised by Robert Ferguson, who for later lighthouses devised a more economical composite construction using angle iron bases, a hardwood timber frame and boilerplate cladding, which was soon adopted. Ferguson was appointed Foreman of Works for the Wide Bay and Burnett region in 1870, and from 1876 as Clerk of Works for the Colonial Architect. Energetic and ambitious, he probably accepted private commissions. In 1868, John Walker of Ballarat opened a branch of his union foundry at Maryborough. In 1872, land opposite the foundry in Zante Street, which you can see is on the eastern side of the town, was acquired by Walker and his partners James Wood and Thomas Braddock, on which Hathershaw, this large house, was built as a residence for Braddock. It may have been designed by Ferguson or maybe James Buchanan, another architect active at the time, if not designed by somebody working for the foundry itself. A more likely commission for Robert Ferguson was the mansion Glen Linden, overlooking the river downstream of the town. It was built in about 1878 by a leading local contractor, John Thomas Annear, who had recently constructed new immigration barracks and public offices at Maryborough for the government, for the colonial architect. And from 1879 he was the contractor for the Maryborough to Gympie Railway. It is remarkable not only for its size, but it's a pioneering high-set house. This isn't two-storied like Rose Hill before. This is just absolutely high-set, and this is 20 years or earlier, or 15 anyway, ahead of most Brisbane ones. And you do get ones on sugar plantations, but not as extraordinary as this. I mean, it's staggering. Like Hathershaw, the roof is steeply pitched, but with Gothic overtones. Robert Ferguson was supervisor of the recent government buildings, and the house has similarities with his own known work. I'm pretty sure the architect is Robert Ferguson. The veranda has a bigger than yours quality, which would stand Glen Linden in good stead today. Upstream of Glen Linden was Dalhousie, which is now demolished, and this is a distant photograph of it, the only one I could find. It's a two-storey house rather than a single storey. The town residence of Percy Ramsay, resident manager and co-owner of Ainda Plantation. He was also a sawmiller and timber merchant and a South Sea Island labour agent. That's a blackbirder. In June 1879, Ramsay and his wife Emmeline acquired the 10-acre site, and in October 1880, the architect Gympie Aston called tenders for a wooden villa, which was single-storey, as I say, was two-storied, not single-storied. It's described as a palatial residence and is prominent in photographic views taken from the town and the gardens. They're pretty distant. In June 1881, the Ramsays had moved in, and Emmeline continued to occupy the house after Percy's death in 1888. Built on the high bank of the river, it probably survived the 1893 floods, when house after house could be seen majestically sailing down the river, and not on a boat. I think Mary's going to show all later. Next upstream was Peter Graham's residence, Duneville, built about 1875. And amongst his somewhat precarious business interests, Graham, like Percy Ramsay, was also a labour agent. The architect, again, could be Robert Ferguson. Oh, sorry, this jumps a bit. The next upstream from The next 8-acre allotment upstream from Dune, Ville, was acquired by Thomas Ramsay of Sydney, a director of the Australian Steam Navigation Company and president of the Bank of New South Wales, who had a house built on the site, which he leased as the residence for the manager of the Bank of New South Wales, until 1877, when new two-storey premises for the bank were built on the corner of Wharf and Richmond Streets that included accommodation on the first floor. The bank occupied only modest single-storey premises, but by 1874 the local bank manager was living in a house called Riversley, the name of this house, which survives with this unusual paired abutting gables, scallop barges and asymmetrical fenestration. It is like a prefabricated house, like prefabricated houses imported for colonial gold rushes, which is just the circumstance in which it was built. I mean, as I say, this is a screensaver. I've never been in the house. I've no idea what it's like. But this is a very unusual pattern of the two gables and is very like catalogues of prefabricated houses. I mean, it'd be very interesting to see inside. In December 1881, the 8-acre allotment, including Riversley, was acquired by R.M. Hine, a famous Maryborough name, who immediately subdivided the estate, which he called Point Lookout, after a place used to sight ships on their slow upstream passage to the original settlement. It became Maryborough's best residential address. Elizabeth Street, parallel to the river through the centre of the estate, was named for Hine's wife, who had died in childbirth in 1879. He remarried. About half the subdivisions of Point Lookout were sold in February 1882, including subdivisions 1 and 2, which included Riversley, to the timber merchant Andrew Heron Wilson. In 1866, when the firm Wilson, Hart and Bartholomew built their sawmill, it was at Granville, East Maryborough. Wilson lived adjacent in a house called Canning Park when the sawmill was destroyed by fire in 1881. The firm, it seemed a fortuitous fire. The firm immediately rebuilt on the Maryborough side of the river, where they had access to the railway, which had just been finished. It was a very crucial business advantage. Riversley, this house, was a convenient temporary residence for Wilson, being just opposite the entrance to the new sawmill, but he had grander plans acquiring Duneville further downstream. He disposed of subs 1 and 2, which included this, to John Walker of the previously mentioned Union Foundry. The boom which funded the construction of these houses continued, inducing several architects to open offices. In 1882, FDG Stanley, the former colonial architect, opened a branch of his private practice. Representing Stanley at Maryborough in 1882-4 was his brother-in-law, the architect Walter Morris Eyre. Stanley's clerk of works was a person called William Devon. Stanley repeated his domination in the 1870s of public buildings and churches at Maryborough with commissions for commercial buildings, which made Maryborough his town by the mid-1880s. Stanley's residential commissions included Clarendon House on the corner of Sussex and Adelaide Street, which replaced Rosehill, that very first house I showed you, as John Eaton's Maryborough residence. It was more conveniently located opposite the Botanic Gardens. In September 1882, Eyre calls tenders for the purchase and removals of cottages on the site and for the erection of a new two-storey timber building. It is well finished but economical, with the frame sheeted both inside and out and with verandas to the facades and sides of both floors. The veranda curtain is notable for being unusually plain, with a flat feet shouldered on the cap mouldings of the fine timber columns. The house was relocated later to Harvey Bay, and the more elaborate fence, I don't think I have that photo. There's a more elaborate fence there now that dates from the Maryborough Club, which replaced it. It's also gone. In 1882, Wilson paid Peter Graham $3,500 for the recently redecorated Duneville, complete with 10 acres of riverfront land. He promptly made changes, including renaming the house Dune Villa, and substantial additions to the house, a gatekeeper's lodge, cellar, and other changes. At least some of these were designed by Stanley, including the distinctive continuous window shade to the bay windows, which is similar to some that Stanley had just recently added to Shafton's house in Brisbane. Wilson, I might say, also relocated his much-loved pot plant house from Canning Park, calling tenders in May 1882 for dismantling and re-erecting the structure, which was 100 feet by 30 feet in size. In 1895, Duneville was described as a large and comfortable habitation, most complete in every department. The notable garden included 2 glass-covered conservatories and an aviary, as well as stabling and outbuildings. Wilson continued to develop Dune Ville, adding somewhat awkwardly to the river elevation a glazed pavilion and accessible roof tower. That's this piece here. This is, I think, the original house, which may be Ferguson. That's part of the Stanley additions, and this was added. I mean, I thought this would be quite early, but you can see from the photograph below, which is of the house at about 1900. This is a house called Blairholme in behind, so that the glazed pavilion has been added to the front later than that. So it's added about after 1900, by which time the Rockhampton architects Eaton and Bates had a branch office at Maryborough, run by the former Adelaide and Broken Hill architect A.D. Garlick, who may have been the architect for what's described as the Saracenic Pavilion. Eaton and Bates used a more integral glazed curtain, but you can relate the two to the river pavilions of Cremorne, a house at Hamilton, that they did a couple of years later in 1905-6. As an example of Stanley's a later work in Stanley's practice up at or work in Maryborough from Stanley are these pair of houses on the corner of North and Lennox Street, built for the Maryborough Town and Suburban Provident Building and Investment Society. Number 22 is called Green Gables. The Society acquired the site in January 1887. In Stanley's office, they were probably designed by C.W. Chambers, who transformed the design morale, if you like, or expectations of that office when he joined the practice in 1885. Despite having closed his branch office at Maryborough, Stanley still regularly visited the town concerning a new fire brigade station that he built at the time and after the Society acquired the North Street site. As I say, the bay window element is common with a lot of these. Another architect to commence practice at Maryborough in 1882 was Willoughby Powell, who immediately caused tenders for a dwelling house for John Walker, probably on the land at the Point Lookout estate, and now number 7 North Street. That's that house Riversley we're looking at. This is its immediate neighbour, and this is the house that I think he caused tenders for. The site, the land containing that is owned by John Walker, and Powell caused tenders for a house for Walker. And previously it's all got mixed up in considering that it was something happening to this. But I think this is going to be the house. It's quite compatible with Powell's work. Anyway, when Walker's house was finished, Powell calls tenders in 1883 for the removal and re-erection of Riversley. It was a larger lot, and the house has now been moved forward to the North Street frontage. After trying unsuccessfully to sell Riversley in 1886, Walker retained it till 1892, when it was transferred to James Ferguson Wood, another founding partner in the Union Foundry, who lived there till his death in 1908. Nearby at 15 North Street was also designed by Willoughby Powell, and that's this house here, with the fancy name Philadelphia Villa, which is a bit more interesting than the poor, slightly mutilated house. It was built for a Gympie mining manager, Philip Heschke, in 1884, who transferred the title in May 1885 to his wife Esther, who sold it before the end of the year. There's lots of speculative building going on. Powell's best-known house in Maryborough, and I didn't talk about it at the conference because someone else was, is Baddow, the 2-storey house Baddow. This is it without its front veranda, sure, but it's opposite, it's near the original settlement, but opposite Rosehill. He also did this fantastic mortuary chapel and a cottage for the caretaker. 2 of Maryborough's best-known houses were built after economic conditions deteriorated in the 1890s. Ilfracombe, 335 Lennox Street, was built in 1894, next door to Dune Villa by A.H. Wilson of Dune Villa for his sister-in-law, and was originally called Blairholme. The architect is not known, but is almost, I think, very likely to be William Devon, FDG Stanley's former clerk of works at Maryborough, or perhaps even Stanley himself, with Devon supervising. In the 1890s, William Devon returned to Maryborough and worked as an architect there until his death in February 1897. Unaraba is the second of those houses of the 1890s, designed by G.H.M. Addison for the solicitor and then mayor of Maryborough, James Stafford. Addison arrived in Brisbane in 1886 and immediately had a major impact with houses of polycomb brickwork with complex polygonal bays and arcades. Unaraba is a simpler construction but elaborately finished internally and externally. Its completion coincided with the introduction of the chrysanthemum to Queensland and you can see them flowering. But Stafford employed a guy called F.W. Turley as his gardener, and soon triumphed in the annual Queensland Horticultural Society's exhibition in Brisbane. I might say his major competitor was A.H. Wilson from Dune Ville, so that Maryborough was at this time the chrysanthemum capital of Queensland. Only a couple of blocks further along Ann Street is this house, Kiumbran, and the library had this small photograph of this very carefully built four-room cottage with a hip box roof and a kitchen wing with an OG veranda at the front only. And I didn't know if the house had survived, but found a photograph of it in the Coley collection, one of the really big library collection of houses. And I was able to locate the house using Google Earth to this 337 Ann Street. It was built for Frederick William Jones after he bought the land in 1896. The photograph dates, I think, from about 1904, but the library has a second photo, which is the one on the right at the top, and it's the most extraordinary edition, where this is the original house, and it's added a whole new front to it, but the main front door is still through the back. I mean, you can't quite imagine how the plan worked. But also more extraordinary is the original kitchen wing, which was on that side of the house, has been swapped to the other side, as you can see from the Google aerial photo. And this is what the house looks like today. I think the additions are influenced by Addison's Unaraba, which is only a sort of block or so further to the west. And perhaps they had a builder or clerk of works in common, and maybe it was F.H. Faircloth, and who I think could have designed this house, and who was the earliest of three architects who came to dominate practice in Maryborough in the early 20th century. In 1900, a new customs house was built at Maryborough with palatial quarters for the collector of customs. I mean, they really lived well. This is the collector's residence. And they were buildings of exceptional quality. The plans were drawn in the Queensland Government Architect's Office by the architect G.D. Payne, using a vocabulary of materials and details borrowed from courthouses at Burke and Wagga in New South Wales. Both of these were the work of George Oakeshott, who just happens to be the grandfather of the federal independent member of Coffs Harbour. But his grandfather was working in the New South Wales Government Architect Office at this time. He and Payne were closely associated with the Architectural Association of Sydney as inaugural vice presidents, and it is likely that Payne brought the vocabulary and perhaps even a set of the plans to Brisbane when he moved there in 1898. The buildings were very influential as a model for subsequent work by others in Maryborough. Gable hip box roofs, this sort of element roof here and the end became very popular form for the next quarter century. Going away from the river is a street called Cheapside, and it's the name of a famous street in the historic and modern financial centre of London. Number 130 Cheapside is a two-storey house, quite unlike any other house in Maryborough. The very large piece of land, it only sits on a small part of a much larger original site, which was granted in September 1857 to two Italians, Angelo del Monico and Sprigalia Giuseppe, who were among the bricklayers brought to Maryborough by John Eaton. This was almost certainly a clay pit site. Anyway, Eaton subsequently acquired the land. That's John Eaton of Rosehill. And in 1879, when he applied to have the land brought under the Real Property Act of 1861, Eaton claimed to have bought it for £2 per acre, less than a month after it was granted in 1857. I imagine this is almost certainly flouting the land grant regulations of the time. But the Registrar General denied Eaton's possession, but the claim was upheld in the Supreme Court, and freehold title was issued to Eaton, and he quickly subdivided the land and sold the subdivisions 16 to 25 in May 1881 to George Byrne, a customs official who built a house on the site. It was sold in 1895 to another blackbirder, and a Gessilano Tamaris, who was drowned in January 1902 when his recruiting vessel, the Sybil, disappeared with all its crew and 42 islanders who'd been recruited in the Solomon Islands. Tamaris' widow sold the house in January 1904 to Ernest Stewart, just after he married Alice Green in Sydney. Ernest was the eldest son of George Stewart, whose drapery palace was the primary emporium in Maryborough. At the wedding, Alice was given away by John B. Spencer, treasurer of the Christian Endeavour movement with which Alice was closely involved, but I recognised the name. He's a well-known Sydney architect. So was this the reason why the house is so unusual? Anyway, after honeymooning in Tasmania, the Stuparts lived at Montville, although I think this might be the name of the house rather than the town in the Blackall Ranges, while the work was done to this house in Cheapside. What might have happened is it might be an alteration to George Burns' earlier house, or it could be a complete rebuild. Again, my knowledge of it consists of looking through the screen of a TV the house was later called Beulah. They called their house Beulah. Ernest had already had a breakdown, and he soon had another. And in 1911 it was announced in Maryborough that he died in a motor accident in Sydney. But a fortnight later, the Sydney Morning Herald reported on his suicide in a private asylum where he was being treated for melancholia. I'm often tempted to contact current owners to see what they know. And I think I don't know whether anyone else will mention telephones, but they're a good research technique. If you've got some names, you never know what people will have. Anyway, the current owner of Beulah knew nothing about the house almost, except that she said it was designed by a Sydney architect. So that was a kind of a real bonus. I think it confirms probably that Spencer, their friend, was the designer. On the corner of Sussex and Bazaar Street near the centre of town is another house, another retired grazier's townhouse. It was built by Ellen Lawless of Booberjan Station in 1910. It's a very strange photo. So it must be a wide-angle lens. This is the right-angle corner. That's the post office up there. So that kind of somewhat distorts the view. Towards the end of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century, more development occurred at Burnett, inducing architects to practice at Bundaberg rather than Maryborough. As I mentioned, there are three architects, F.H. Faircloth, H.W.F. Palmer and P.O.E. Hawkes, were important in the Wide Bay Burnett in the first half of the 20th century. The earliest was Faircloth, born in Maryborough in 1870. He was architect to Bundaberg architect Anton Hetrick and worked in Melbourne in 1892-3 before establishing a practice at Bundaberg in 1893, where he worked until his death in 1925. I mean, it's curious to wonder if Faircloth had some involvement with Addison on his way back and had a role in the building of Unaraba before he sets up his own practice. There's some mysteries about the construction of Unaraba, which will be resolved maybe with the digitisation of the newspaper. The architect is assumed, I assume the architect for Ellen Lawless's house, this house, is F.H. Faircloth on the strength of its similarity with Baramba Homestead, which is definitely his. There are tender notices and a well-established history for the house. Anyway, I think almost certainly that Faircloth is the architect for this house. Just before the First World War, Glen Olive at 23 Churchill Street, one of Maryborough's most prominent dwellings, was erected for a dentist called Harry Watson, who purchased the site in September 1914. The first part of the house, which I'm assuming is this bit, was constructed soon after. Somewhat surprisingly, it's mirror reversed diagonally behind, and so it joins on like a very elaborate expanded version of that semi-detached kitchen in behind, and then later this polygonal porch was added. It shares quite a lot of its details are shared with other houses. These are some, and these are much later ones around 1930. But they all have a kind of firm hand that I'm sure is the work of an architect. And my guess, with having done no work on him at all, is that it'll be H.F.W. Palmer. He is the grandson of a pioneer in the district and was article to the leading Melbourne architects Klingender and Allsop. In 1908, when Hawkes was also working in that office, they may have decided to practice together in the Wide Bay Burnett district. Hawkes came to Brisbane in 1909 and worked briefly for the Works Department before he commenced to practice at Bundaberg. And he was later in Kingaroy before he returned to practice in Maryborough. After returning to Maryborough, Palmer commenced practice there in 1911. And Hawkes and Palmer had some association, it's a bit unclear what it was, from 1914 to 17. They had separate offices in different towns. Palmer's work is not known, but I think quite a few houses will eventually turn out to be his. These are more modest houses in in Albert Street, 356 and 360. And the one on the left, 356, this one is earlier, the one with the OG roof. And it was, I think, it was built, I think, speculatively again for Thomas Miller, a miner at Mount Morgan, who purchased 3 allotments in 1895. Or if he didn't, it was Daniel O'Neill probably who owned them for about 1900. And the OG proportions and the OG roof and general proportions of 356 are comparable to houses at Gympie, such as Wendouree, built in 1896. And it's similar to this house up at the top. 25 years ago, I tried to relate this apparent popularity in Gympie for OG profile veranda roofs and a distinctive colour preference to H.W. Durich, an architect who dominated practice there for more than 30 years and who also opened an office in Maryborough in 1882. I hope that Durich would prove to be a good example of an individual being responsible, which was seen in 1975 as regional variation, but I've not been able to make any direct connection. Without plans surviving or definite records, it is difficult, and this is often the case. But there are in Maryborough other houses with OG roofs, and which are earlier than 356 Albert Street, but none I know predate the opening by Durich of his branch office. And an early example is this house on the top right, which is called Hazelton. It was built speculatively by a leading contractor, Fritz Kine, who had carried out a number of major contracts for FDG Stanley, and I think might have provided the plans for his spec house. When Kine purchased the site in October 1884, Stanley was represented at Maryborough by a young English architect, Edward Wells Russell, who had replaced W.M. Eyre in July 1884. Russell only remained at Maryborough until he took charge of Stanley's Toowoomba office in November 1885, but it was more than enough time for him to have designed this house. And so that's a curious change in that theory, where the OG roofs might have started in Maryborough and been taken back to Gympie by Durich, still to be worked out. Anyway, Hazelton was sold in February 1886 to David Clark, a chemist in Ken Street, to Mary Ann Hurst, a confectioner also of Ken Street, and in 1903 to William John Tarrant, an agent for motorcycles and later motor vehicles. The interesting but not unique roof vent on Hazelton, that's the top right, has been removed, and the gable entry significantly augmented and colonialised. And this is not an unusual pattern in Maryborough. There's more colonialising going on in Maryborough than there was in colonial time. There's an awful lot of... I haven't got the picture there. That's difficult. I've cut it out. Oh. This has now got an elaborate porte cochere and fret-cut barges, and it's really an extravagant piece of work. And the fence, which is interesting too, I think was done by a contractor who lived further along Ferry Street. He lived in a rendered masonry house. That's surprising. But there are a group of similar houses in the vicinity. Just these group here, these three, not this one, and they're similar in proportion masonry. They don't all have OG roofs, although some of them do. This one, but they have similar stair details often that are unusual and surprising. So whether this Fritz Kine still working or whether they're coming out of Stanley's office or not, I'm not sure. There are some others there are a lot of these OG houses around. This is one over in Percy Street, which is off the top of the map. And it's really done about the same time as Hazelton. So maybe Stanley's office or maybe Durich. But comparable to my Durich's hypothesis was another which proposed that Maryborough houses with gabled hip box roofs with arched veranda curtains infilled with battens, vertical battens, like that 360 house, this one, the second one of those, were the work of P.O.E. Hawkes. And amongst few theses written on regional architects is Sue Hugg's thesis on P.O.E. Hawkes. The earliest works cited in the thesis are at Bundaberg from 1912, 3 years after Hawkes was in practice there, and from Maryborough from 1914 when Hawkes and Parker had that association I mentioned. Work in Maryborough was identified indexing the Maryborough Chronicle for tender notices after the First World War, but many identify only a street and no client. From 1924 there was a building register of Maryborough with applications for building approval. It is more informative. It may be more informative, but I don't know if architects are identified always. In the case of number 360, the research was inconclusive, but I think it was built for John O'Brien, who purchased the site in 1918. But more conclusive evidence for the Hawkes hypothesis are two houses in 5860 Churchill Street, for which tenders were called for a pair of houses in January 1920, and it's listed in Sue Hugg's thesis, catalogue 1920/2. In this instance, the tender notice also identified a client. So using Google Maps, it was easy to, first of all, pick up a pair in the street, and then it was possible by doing a title search to find that the owner of the property was, in fact, the person for whom the tender was called. So these houses are definitely done by Hawkes. I mean, the colour scheme's changed, and this one's considerably more altered than its neighbour. Just throwing in a couple more Maryborough houses that might be Hawkes. These are two house neighbours in North Street, and the earlier one is built for a cinema, the proprietor of a picture theatre, and it's fairly flamboyant, and although it's early and doesn't rate in Sue Hugg's thesis, I'm certain it's Hawkes. Its neighbour is this fantastic house that you can see rather better in the library's photographs than you can in fact, and it's 1919, built for a butcher, David Jackson. That house at Eskdale was on a very large piece of land, and after the Second World War, it was subdivided to provide two sites, 4 houses for the 4th generation in this Corsa family. And this house here, which is at Palace Street, 47 Palace Street, is definitely Hawkes. There's a tender notice for that. I thought the one round in Ann Street, this, which is earlier by a year or so, was probably Faircloth, but it's very similar to later Hawkes' work, so that's a bit inconclusive also. I put these in partly because they relate. The 3 photos from the top are from this Coley collection, and the bottom are the 3 photos from Google Maps. And you can see they're built at 2-year intervals. The earliest one, the one on the right, then the one on the far left, and the one in the middle is the latest 1917. The one on the left is one of these cases where there's quite a lot of work being done conserving the house, I guess, although you wonder then about the cast iron, whether that's invention. I did wonder whether there are lots of veranda roofs that seem to have been re-roofed in Maryborough to give them eaves, which was a sensible enough thing to do. But in fact, it does appear in the Coley photos that it already happened there. So I'm not so certain about that. I was assuming there were alterations always. But I've done a whole stack of houses in this way all over the town. Hawkes continued to do work, or did work for the War Service Homes program, and there are quite a lot of unidentified tenders for houses called by him. And it's not, I don't know whether he designed them or their standard plans. The State Advances Corporation, I turned up a lot of houses by them too, but I haven't followed the files, although there are a particular group of files which are auction perpetual leases, I think they're called, which are a fantastic land title arrangement where the government gives the land to the local hospital and they derive the rent for it towards the operating costs of the hospital. And they're quite detailed files that include quite a lot of information about improvement, and they include several State Advances Corporation, that's the predecessor of the Queensland Housing Commission. But in the 1930s, this state government department ran a scheme called the Building Revival Scheme, which included making funds available to householders to extend their houses. And this is a house at 226 Alina Street, now demolished, which is an example of that. Built only in 1925, but extended 5 years later to look like that. And that's typical, and they were very proud of the fact that it was unrecognisable. I like the original one too. I'm nearly at the end. In the 1930 mansions in Maryborough were again being built of brick. The top one, this one is one of Hawkes, called Corinna. Queensland survived the Depression somewhat better than southern states, and especially the sugar industry was relatively prosperous, so there was still quite a bit of money around Maryborough. This was designed by Hawkes in 1933 for Herb Williams. Tenders were called in May, built by Brisbane builder Maryborough Company, and it combines sort of elements of California bungalows, but with arts and crafts elements too. This house is designed by a Brisbane architect called Horace Driver, and it's designed also for Williams, the person who built the previous house, and it was designed for his unmarried daughter Alice. Driver trained and worked in Brisbane, and then worked in San Francisco and Chicago before studying from 1927 at the Beaux-Arts Institute of Design in New York. And the institute offered courses in architecture, sculpture, and mural painting. And Driver received a medal as best student in 1930 before he returned to Brisbane. river use is very picturesque, and Driver was very capable. And like a number of other Brisbane architects, was adept at designing in various styles, which promoted, while also promoting modern design. Another house designed by Driver at 3 Churchill Street that I don't have a picture for is stylistically, in any way, a bit more up to date. After World War II, the use of timber was reduced, using sheet materials for linings and later brick veneers cladding, like in these townhouses, which there are a lot in Maryborough. The huffing and puffing of a big bad wolf was not necessary to blow houses of sticks away. Some of the owners contributed, as in this poor house at 5 Wood Street. It's even more bizarre when you see the roof plan. Some owners contributed, as I say, to clearing, but the clearing of the pine scrubs and hardwood forests achieved the same result as the big bad wolf if it took somewhat longer. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Don. And I think one of the things that indicates too is the many different histories that might be made from looking at this type of material. And we were getting the benefit of a specialist historian looking at those images, that are many of which are here upstairs in the John Oxley Library. But I must say it made me want to know a history of butcher shops in Queensland. And as a non-specialist historian, I kept on getting distracted by how many times I could see washing on the verandas, how many kids I saw, and the number of cats that were there. But of course it also was telling us about the history of architects, labourers, their relationship to the South Sea Islander trade, speculation and the expansion of towns. So the history of the house in Queensland and the types of material that we're getting insight into here, and that you can also pursue upstairs at the John Oxley, tells many stories. But it's time now for Annabel Lloyd, Brisbane City Council Archivist, to talk about the practicalities of research methodologies and to share some of her own finds and insights into the Queensland house.
Thank you, Kate. I thought I would share with you today, I think I'm having a brief time, the story of Penny Lane, which is a house that still stands at 69 Simpson Road, Barden. And this is how the story of the house came to us and how we use some of our records to find out this house history. So this is the interior of Penny Lane. So about 10 years ago, we were contracted by a woman in England who had these 2 images in her possession, and she was cleaning up a relative's estate. She knew nothing about them, and when they arrived in the mail, all they had on the back of them was the house name, Penny Lane, and a Miss Cecil. And that was all we knew. We loved them immediately because we have very few images of the internal pictures of Queensland homes. And at the time we were creating our online database, Brisbane Images, so we put it on Brisbane Images, we tagged it as Queensland Homes. We have a number of images tagged on our database, and thought nothing more of it. So we fast forward then to about 2010, and we received another email from someone in England. This time this woman was researching the history of a relative who had lived as a boarder in a house in Penny Lane, called Penny Lane in Brisbane. And I'm sorry to say too, we knew that it was in Upper Paddington. The original photograph had the address Upper Paddington, which of course no longer exists. So we had no way. But the second woman that contacted us knew that, again, that the relative had boarded at Penny Lane in Upper Paddington and wanted to know if the house still existed. But we were fortunate this time because we had more records to search. And as Don has pointed out, we went to Trove. And I hope many of you have been to Trove. And by searching Trove, we immediately discovered Miss Cecil's story. And I simply did, if you've used Trove a lot, the best way to do it is do an advanced search. So we did advanced search on the name Penny Lane and specifically restricted our searching to Queensland newspapers. So we found her death notice, a summary of her will, and various advertisements for domestic employment and for boarders as well. So the story, it seemed Miss Cecil was a spinster, and she had migrated from England to Brisbane about 1904 following a serious bicycle accident, and she was advised to move to better climes for her recovery. And she spent a number of years living with friends and travelling around Australia before finally buying the land and building the house, probably around and 1915. So, and also helped us, this also helped explain now some of the photo, because we always wondered how the photo came to be. So you can tell now this is obviously Miss Cecil and her boarders, sending a photo home to England saying, you know, we're living well in the colonies, we still have our tea and cats and dogs. Actually, the cat's an important issue, because if you look at her will, somewhere in her will, it points out, it even goes down the fact that her cats were to be put down because they couldn't bear to live without, by the local vet, although the dog, we're pleased to say, found a home. So it was quite... and the newspapers even told us more about the house. And now this is a very interesting one. This is actually the sale notice for the house, which was from March 1919. Miss Cecil had died in January 1919, suddenly. And you can see that, again, a lovely description. Tells you who the neighbours are, in case you want to go and live with your well-connected neighbours. And we know now that it was a well-built residence of modern design. It had electricity, water, all the rest. But what was very important to us when we were we still at this stage didn't know where Penny Lane was or whether it was still there. However, in the notice is a real property description. Sorry, I don't know how to get this pointer going, but you can probably see it there in that second line. Now, that was the key that then enabled us to go and find, and I think Mary will talk more about lands titles, but once you've got a real property description, it can really help you find it. So we then went specifically to some of our records that we have in the Brisbane City Council archives to look at more. One of the things we have are the surveyor's field books. Some of you may be familiar with them if you've come to our process and researched them. The surveyor's field books, or the detailed plans as we call them, specifically relate to sewerage. And so they were drawn up for sewerage, so they vary a bit in date and when they were done, but they very nicely show the outline of the houses in them. And we also have the original field books, and that upper photo is a field book, which often the surveyor's field books have more detail in them, and sometimes also have the name of the house on it, so we can actually trace it back through this. In this case, we had to use parish maps to work out from the real property description where it was, but what it did give us was a number. So we now knew it was 96 Simpson Road, Barden. And of course what we could then do is go to Google Maps today, and sure enough, the house is still there. And the image on this page is actually from the 1946 aerial photographs. We have a complete set of 1946 aerial photographs for the city in the archives. You can actually come and look at them and photocopy them for 20 cents. But another distinguishing feature of this house, of course, was the path. And you can see there, it's the house on the very corner. I don't know how I get this. That might be it there. But it's the house. Oh, what have I done there? I shouldn't touch things, should you, Annabel? Yeah, never know. I'll go back to view. Slideshow. But I'll quickly go through, but you can see that path there, and that also made determining the house. So it's really good if you're trying to find a house, if you've got distinguishing features, it makes going through the records much easier. So we now had lots of images, and we knew where it was. But what of Penny Lane post Miss Cecil? As we said, Miss Cecil died in 1919. By sheer luck, when we were looking at Trove, we found a really interesting newspaper article from September 1919, 9 months after Miss Cecil had died. And it seems that I've forgotten the name of the person, but Joyce, that's right, James Joyce, had lost his dog. Keeping a theme with dogs. Unfortunately, we don't know whether J. Joyce ever found his dog, but when we went to our rates records, and our earliest surviving rate records in Brisbane are 1940, unfortunately, but we discovered that a B. Joyce, a Barbara Joyce, we assume his wife, is still owns and resides at the property, so we assume that it was still the same owner. We then went to our post-46 building records, which include building cards, and there was no building applications made for the property until 1982, when they put in a pool. And so the story continues. We do have earlier building registers in the archives, Unfortunately, they only cover the original Brisbane City area, which is why we couldn't do them for Penny Lane, because Penny Lane was in the Ithaca Shire Council. But most local, I think Don did mention building records, and if you've got them in the local area, they are really useful. And in deference to the title, I dug this photo out of a stick home in Auchenflower around 1870. And finally, if you do want to know more about your searching in Brisbane, I've actually produced a document with hyperlinks in it. If you want to email me, and that's my email address there, cityarch, C-A-R-C-H, at brisbane.qld.gov.au, I'd be happy to forward you a copy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabel, and what a fantastic story. And again, a snapshot into yet another way of thinking about the Queensland House. Because it's semi-institutional, I guess it's a boarding house. It's a different way of thinking about women's lives and domestic arrangements in the 1910s. We're getting insight into ads for maids, into the layout of the house. Again, this tiny snapshot is giving us insight into a whole different way of thinking about both Queensland history and the research that we might do. And I'll just witter on briefly while the important bits of technology are working. And so Mary Howells is a historian from the Department of Environment and Heritage Protection, and she's going to add to this picture for us again of both the complexity of the research you might undertake as well as what the Queensland House really is. So, Mary Howells.
Okay. And thanks, Kate, and I'll try not to trip over this cord down here that they've set as a trap for us presenters today. So my name's Mary Howells. Has already been said, and I'm a historian. I'm working in the Heritage branch of the Department of Environment and Heritage Protection. And Annabel has provided us with an excellent guide for researching properties in Brisbane, and I'm just trying to give you a little overview of where you might look if you're not fortunate enough to live in Brisbane to be able to access Annabel's wonderful resources she has at the Brisbane City Archives. So despite what you may have seen on Who's Been Sleeping in My House, the easiest place to start when researching a house is to do a title search. And a title search might look something like this. Now, these title searches can be done at the Department of Natural Resources and Mines Business Centres. They have branches throughout the state, and their head office is at 53 Albert Street in Brisbane. Or you can actually order and pay online if you have your property description of your house. The costs range from between $14 to $21 per title, and I can't pretend to predict how many titles may be involved in any particular search because each is different. But if those of you who are doing family history will know that it's $37 a pop to get birth, death, marriage certificates these days. So I think the $14 to $21 price range is probably good value for money. And don't assume that the first person mentioned on these titles was the person who built your house. So this happens to be where I live at Wellington Point, first owned by Thomas Lodge Murray Pryor, who was later the Postmaster General, later by Louis Hope, who established the sugar plantation at Ormiston, and then on to a speculative investment. And I have had arguments with people in Wellington Point who swear that Thomas Lodge Murray Pryor built their house. Well, no, he didn't, sorry. He owned land all over the place, as did Louis Hope. Really, it's only going to be the indication of a mortgage that may indicate when a house was built. You may also like to use cadastral maps and survey plans to get an understanding of the breakdown of the subdivision of where you live. And they can also be sourced at the Natural Resources and Mines Service Centre. You can also get cadastral maps at the State Archives or at the Lands and Mapping and Surveying Museum. Now, council rate books can be wonderful, as Annabel mentioned, and in this particular case I was fortunate enough that the Cleveland rate books from 1887 actually indicate which allotments have houses on them. That's actually quite rare to find that. Generally you would be looking for an indication of whether a block of land was either occupied or unoccupied, because the rates were charged according to whether anyone lived there or not. So that would be your kind of identifier. And again, you need to know your early property description, which you would have got from your title search. Aerial photography also can be useful. Of course, there weren't aerial photography done until the war years, so it generally dates from about 1944 onwards, but again, that can be really useful. And of course, as was mentioned earlier, don't assume that your house was always there or it hadn't been moved from somewhere else. So we all know the used house lot up at Burpengary on the way to the North Coast, where you can come and pick your house and move it onto your allotment. And it's quite common in Queensland to be moving houses. I know there's one where I live at Wellington Point that's just been moved for the third time in its life, so they just keep on moving. Now, okay, so a mortgage is, generally speaking, for those of us who aren't wealthy, the way of identifying when a property was built. So in this case, the mortgage on this property indicates that it was financed by the Queensland Government Savings Bank. And this was the commencement of what was known as the Workers' Dwelling Act, which was from 1909, which provided low-cost housing to Queensland workers. Later it was managed by the Queensland State Advances Corporation, and later again the Queensland Housing Commission. So many of these plans are available in the annual reports, which are held in the Queensland Parliamentary Papers. Now these you can get on microfilm here at the State Library or at the State Archives, and you'll have to go to the annual reports for the particular department that was in charge at any particular time, which can get confusing. So starting with the Queensland Government Savings Bank and then moving on to State Advances and then Housing Commission. It's like we've all just had changes of departments, and that's been ongoing. Now, just going back to rate books, which I mentioned earlier, the other thing that you need to find out is which particular local government managed your area at a particular time. So these change over time as well, as we all know. There have been major restructuring and amalgamations, particularly in 1903. In 1925, when Greater Brisbane was formed and a lot of smaller councils were merged in to create Brisbane. After the war in 1948 and 1978, a special act of Parliament created Logan Shire at that time. And then in 1995 and again in 2008, we had further council amalgamations. So, for example, a property in Waterford was located in the Waterford Division from 1880, the Waterford Shire from 1903, the Albert Shire from 1949, Gold Coast in 1995, and it's now in Logan. That property hasn't moved. The council has. So this is what you're dealing with. You need to know, how that all panned out. Right. Just moving on here. Okay. So the other quite common financer of homes was what I thought was just called war service homes, and when I tried to put that search term into the National Archives, I got nothing. So in fact, you have to search under Defence Department housing, which is the current terminology. But this, these are all through the National Archives. So it comes down to understanding who created the documents that you may be looking for, where you get your breakdown from State Archives, hold all the documentation produced by the Queensland State Government. The National Archives will be the Commonwealth Government. And so Defence has always been, apart from in the Boer War, but we won't go there, it was always been part of the Commonwealth Government. So you can get some war service home plans at the National Archives, and there are quite a few online here at the State Library. Then the Queensland Housing Commission, which kicked in after the First World War. Again, you can have, I think Miles has got some plans out upstairs from the Queensland Housing Commission, and also the State Archives have plans for their housings. And then I came across this lovely little one online from the State Library. It's just a lovely collection of homes for everyday Queenslanders, so it's also worth having a look at. And then for those of you who are lucky enough to afford some of the beautiful homes that Don showed us earlier, his book, Queensland Architects, his and his wife, Judith Mackay's book, Queensland Architects of the 19th Century, may provide some assistance to you if your house dates back to the 19th century. And Don and Judith have also produced the Directory of Queensland Architects up till 1940, which lists the architects. So in that case, you may want to do a trove search for tender notices for architects you think may have designed your house. So if you're ready to start researching your house and you're not in Brisbane, try your local council. Some council customer service areas actually provide online mapping and online aerial photography, as Annabel mentioned, Brisbane City does. And some do hold house plans for maybe just the previous 10 years. It will depend on the individual council. You'll have to double check that. And some of them still hold their rate books. So some rate books have gone to the State Archives, but some are still held by local councils. And I hate to admit I've seen some stored in some appalling places at local historical societies as well. So they are an exceptionally valuable resource, and I would encourage anyone who knows of any lurking in someone's awful back shed to get them off to the State Archives. Your local council hopefully will have a local history library. These are becoming much more common, I shouldn't say common, but a useful resource, certainly in the major cities of Queensland. And they generally have historic photographs, some hard copy, some online. The same as the State Library has a huge collection of photographs and only a small percentage are online. Family history resources can also be useful in helping you understand information about the family who may have built your house or subsequent owners. Your local library may also have oral history interviews with pioneering families or be able to point you in the direction of knowledgeable locals in their historical societies and museums. The State Archives will have council rate books and minute books, hopefully. Wills can be very useful, and even finding what happened to your poor kitty cat after you've passed on. Insolvencies, business regulations, land selection files, immigration, they are on microfilm at the State Library as well, electoral rolls. And just going back to immigration, once the Federation had occurred, a lot of immigration to Queensland was actually managed through Victoria, because Victoria was the seat of government before Canberra was built. So some Queensland immigration is actually held within the Victorian records, but we still have the microfilm here at State Library, so just keep that in mind. Electoral rolls can be really useful, and the government gazettes and parliamentary papers, and the Housing Commission plans and photographs. Again, the State Library has historic photographs, some online and some hard copy, published histories, family history resources. The newspaper's on microfilm for all of those that aren't yet on Trove, but we're looking forward to them getting there soon. And similarly, immigration, electoral rolls, etc. Now, just briefly at the end, I thought I'd just show you, as Annabel did, a property that I researched for heritage listing about 18 months ago. And I was lucky that I was provided with historic family photographs and plans for this particular property. But it was built by a Maltese migrant family who moved to North Queensland. The husband came out initially in about 1911, and his immigration records I did find in Victoria, so that's why I alerted you to that. But by 1933, he was the wealthiest cane farmer in North Queensland, and 1939, he had this house built for his rather large family, on the Esplanade in Cairns. So very quickly, these are the architect's drawings which I was fortunate to get. And these are just some of the sources I looked at in researching. So this is what I'm trying to get you to think. You've got to think very laterally about where you might look to get information. And curiously, I started with their obituaries in the Cairns newspaper, and this was all before the Cairns newspapers came online. I used the electoral rolls because the family were cane farming and they were building up their business. They did move quite a bit before they built this house. So it was getting an understanding of where the family moved to within that sort of Babinda and Cairns region. And really you have to just look in the electoral rolls of the area where you think they lived. You can cross-check with the post office directories. But post office directories for country areas aren't as useful as they are for Brisbane. Brisbane, you'll get the exact order of where people lived in a street, whereas in a country town, you'll just get an alphabetical list. I also looked in the Catholic Leader newspaper because Mr. Zammit, who built this house, very generously built a church up in Bardell Frere. And so... Again, it's about lateral thinking. So I knew he was a staunch Catholic and I knew he'd done various things, and that led me to look for more information in the Catholic newspaper as well as the Cairns newspapers. Secondary sources, I did a lot of work on Maltese migration generally because he then helped a lot of other migrants that moved to Queensland once he was established. The Cairns Heritage Walk showed me a bit more information of the context of where his property was. And this particular house was curious because it wasn't just about the family, it was about the architecture, because it wasn't a typical Queensland house. It was a house that employed elements of what was typical to Maltese housing. So I actually contacted the equivalent of the Malta Cultural Heritage branch over there to see what I could find out from them. And ultimately found a very good article online on Maltese house design, but also spent a bit of time here at the State Library looking through their architecture books. So again, just think laterally. So remember next time you are watching Who Do You Think You Are or Who's Been Sleeping in My House, only the really interesting people get to go on this show. Michael Parkinson was rejected because his family were just too boring. He only had coal miners and domestic servants in his family, so it's only the really kooky, interesting ones that make it to the screen. And I can guarantee most of them took a team of researchers more than 6 months to do most of these projects. It's not as wonderful and simple as it appears on screen. And so similarly with Who's Been Sleeping in My House, to stop me yelling at the television, which I do every time I watch it, start with a title search, because that will give you the basic bones of how to get started on this project. But you will notice that he goes to lots of different places looking for his information and talks to a lot of people. So start researching and go to it and have fun.
Thank you very much to Mary. Now, I was going to sit here and grill our three experts and make some more connections between their work, but I don't think we're actually going to have time to do that. So I will just say we might have time for a question or two from the audience, if possible. But I would also like to let people know there is a handout, if you'd like to pick it up at the door, of resources available here at the John Oxley Library. And there's also a fantastic collection of material upstairs, which are both examples of what we've heard from here, but also some quite interesting examples of the types of things that, again, the sort of lateral things Mary was talking about. So we heard, for example, about subdivision maps. Well, there are some commercial estate maps upstairs that are beautiful objects to look at, but also have details about things like the price of the land, and again give you a sense of how some areas were being developed and the shapes that they were being made. So that's looking at Queensland houses before the houses are even there. But we do only have 5 minutes left, and so I think the best thing would be if anybody has a question from the floor that you'd like to put. We'd love to, if you don't mind, just waiting for that microphone, both so we can all hear you and so we can have it recorded, because, again, you can listen to this online if there's any details that you missed. Far away.
I'd quite like to research a house in Anley, which family law says was built for my grandfather and his soon-to-be wife after the First World War. The house hasn't. It was built by his uncle. The house is no longer in the family. Do I have the right to go up to the title search office and?
Yeah, they have historic. They're called historic title searches. So information that's just like when I talked about the Penny Lane house. The house the information that's more than 30 years old is public, so you can do a historic title search. You can find out the owner's name obviously through public records, but yes, you can do historic. You just have to say you're doing a historic title search.
Thank you.
Okay. I was just going to say, but if you want to actually get details of a family, birth certificates and so on, you can't get those.
Oh no. Not unless they've been published. Some very early death marriages have been published,
and you can find them in the birth death marriages in the newspapers quite often.
And you can go through the newspapers.
A question for Annabel.
Sure.
A preamble, I guess. I'm one who really enjoys looking at the air photos, the 1946 air photo layer, along with the other air photo layers on the city maps that are available on the BCC website through under the Development and Building tab.
Yep.
I also love the sewerage detail plans.
Yep.
Oh, everybody does.
I'm a complete... me and the Metropolitan Board of Works are just like that. What can we do as users and fans of this material to induce the BCC to put a layer of detail plans on the same system as the air photos?
Well, I've actually moved one step closer to making the detailed plans available. I've digitalised them now, so we have digital copies and they're held by me at the archives. The problem with putting them onto biomap is you've got to do geographical referencing across, and that's expensive and time-consuming and a little bit tricky. I think we'll probably move more. We are looking at more to a model where we'll put the indexes that we use for the building, for the detailed plans online at some point with the digital copies. So you'll use the original indexes that go with the detailed plans to find the detailed plan and then find the digital copy that way.
That's good. That's
but
helpful.
But I am working on it. In the meantime, you're welcome to come to the City Archives and look at our digital copies.
Thanks. Just one more thing. There are other cities in the world where that sort of geo-referencing work is done by crowdsourcing, so that there's a way for people of goodwill to do some of that menial work.
Yeah, and we'd be quite happy to, and that's part of the reason why I've digitalised stuff, because we're quite happy for people to take the stuff we've digitalised and geo-reference them themselves if they want to.
And the sort of links that that Don was talking about too, where you're taking the historical visual material in the State Library and then matching it with Google Maps too, I think is quite valuable. But I should also say, because I imagine that politically you might all be rather constrained in mentioning this, of course in states all across Australia at the moment there is considerable pressure happening on access to archives, and reading rooms, for example, of the State Archives in Sydney have just been, some of them have been closed. And so there's quite a lot of political pressure and agitation going on, for example, from the Australian Historical Association and other organisations about keeping access to these public archives, readily available. And I think that is something for anybody who's interested in historical research to think about and possibly to agitate about as an important issue, which I suspect my esteemed colleagues may feel restrained about saying.
Well, I think on that score, I think there are rumours that Trove is going to slow down, and that would be a terrible shame, I think, if they start cutting expenditure on that. That has been absolutely staggering.
But having mentioned crowdsourcing, anybody who does research on Trove also becomes an active user and participant in it if you put in that extra effort to either add in your own metadata, to correct the spelling, which sometimes when you're doing a huge search you think, I don't have time to pick up all of these funny bits and pieces, but it actually is very helpful to other users. So we're now all implicated in the research process in a way that I think is quite interesting.
And I think we are very happy to share our material. As I said, the first step for me, the easiest thing within my control is to digitalise material from my collection, like most archives. So I have digitalised, and some of our parish maps as well I've digitalised, and we're quite happy to share that with people who want to take it, start geo-referencing it and crowdsourcing it and playing with it. And I think that's an important first issue.
Now, I have to apologise. I can see that there are lots of other questions and issues here, but I believe we're under some time pressures. But I'd like to thank both the State Library and the Department of Environment and Heritage Protection, and of course the three little pigs for inspiring the discussion tonight. And one of those little pigs can be found listed in the welfare register upstairs. Another was a successful developer who made a killing on canal developments, and the final little pig decided to build boarding houses all over Queensland, but that's another story. And of course many thanks to architectural historian Don Watson, archivist Annabel Lloyd from Brisbane City Council, and historian Mary Howells from the department, and of course to the SLQ librarian Miles Cinnamon, who's brought together many fantastic items upstairs on level 4 in the John Oxley Library. So please do, if you've got time, head up to look at that material. And please do join me again on the 18th of July for a discussion of Queensland's literary heritage. Thank you.